happened in America. We had a civil war, but also at the same time throughout Europe, there were wars of consolidation, wars that were being fought between industrial and agrarian interests. So you can look at the war that happened in Italy, for example. There was a civil war in Italy, same agrarian versus industrial interests. And it was a bloody civil war in Italy as well. Look up Garibaldi's army. So we had this consolidation that happened into the nation states. Now the nation states are consolidating into global governance, but there is a pushback. In America, we have the Donald Trump campaign. In Europe, there are political parties that are forming to fight this. And what we see happening is the potential that Europe and this concentration of power, as they're trying to consolidate to the next level with these global trade agreements, that it may begin to unravel at the bottom. So they're fighting this with everything that they have. Now, before we go to Lord Monckton, I want to play the beginning of this movie that you can watch online. It's called Brexit the Movie. And I want to play the trailer for their movie because it lays this down for you as to what's at stake. If you're not following this, if you're in Britain and you're not following it, shame on you. But if you're in America and you haven't really followed this, this will give you an idea for this. Let's go to the trailer for Brexit the Movie.
We, the people, are being cajoled, frightened, and bullied into surrendering our democracy and freedom. This film is a rallying cry. We must fight for our independence, for the right to determine ourselves, the laws under which we live, and for the freedom to shape our own future.
This is the most important voting decision that any of us is going to make in our lifetime. With general elections, it doesn't really matter who you vote for, Conservative or Labour, because you know that in 4 years' time, you can change your mind. This time, you can't change your mind. This time is for keeps.
In this film, we'll see how the EU works.
It's like heaven for the politician or bureaucrat because it's power without accountability.
It was devised to make sure that the great mass of the people could not control government ever again.
The EU is turning into a dictatorship, and this is not overstating it.
We will see what the EU has done to Britain.
The EU has just obliterated the English fishing industry altogether.
The European policies that we face are really the single biggest threat to our competitiveness.
We'll see why Fortress Europe has been such a calamity for the European economy.
What we see is the EU bringing up the drawbridge.
The European Union has become an economic basket case.
Certainly it is not in our economic interests to remain within the European Union. No way.
We will look at the risks of tying our fate to the failing EU.
Extremism at both ends is being fostered by the anti-democratic nature of the European Union.
Far from being it safer for us to be in the EU, there are dangers.
All right, so you can see the rest of that, and you can watch that movie online to define what that is. Stay with us. We're going to be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and joining us now is Lord Christopher Monckton from the UK. We're going to talk about Brexit, which comes up for a vote tomorrow. You heard the clip in the last hour. We had Boris Johnson close the debates last night, made a rousing speech saying all you hear from the other side is fear. We offer you the opportunity to take control of your lives. He said tomorrow can be our Independence Day. So we're going to talk to Lord Monckton about that. So we have introduction, of course. If you're a listener to Infowars.com, you've heard him on many times. We have Lord Monckton on to talk. He is an expert on global warming. He's been very effective at fighting the lies of Al Gore and others, the censorship that we see surrounding man-made global warming narratives. He's done that in the UK. Of course, he's also a businessman. He's a newspaper editor. He's an inventor, a classical architect, and, of course, the high priest of climate skepticism. But today we're going to talk to him about what's going on with globalism. Also, if you want to find Lord Monckton, you can find him at scienceandpublicpolicy.org, where you'll find many of his papers published, and whatsupwiththat.com, where you'll find information where he exposes the lies of climate alarmism. But today we're going to talk about Brexit. We're going to talk about the economic issues. We're going to talk about the sovereignty issues. We're going to talk about the political consequences, both in Britain and in the United States, because this is a worldwide issue that is happening right now. Joining us now is Lord Christopher Monckton. Thank you for joining us, Lord Monckton.
Well, David, it's a pleasure to be with you. And my goodness, it's exciting here because I can't tell you who is going to win this vote tomorrow. I hope it's going to be the Brexiteers. I've already cast my vote by post. but it's too close to call. It could go either way. But you're quite right. In your introduction and in that wonderful film, and all of the people who you showed clips of are friends of mine, this is an enormous blow. The fact that we've even got this referendum is an enormous blow against global government power. Yes. They didn't ever want us to have this vote. And at least we've got the chance to have our say. And it's very evenly divided between, roughly speaking, the left and the centre-right, between the establishment and the ordinary folk, between the givers and the gobblers, to use the 8 rands metric. And what is fascinating is that practically the entire global establishment, so terrified are they at the idea of Britain leaving the EU, that we've had Mr. Obama speaking out, we've had Angela Merkel, the president of Germany, speaking out, we've had, or the chancellor, she's called, we've had Francois Hollande speaking out, we've had the head of the World Bank speaking out, we've had all manner, with the head of the Bank of England, who is not allowed to speak out of political matters, he has spoken out, and all of these are, of course, wanting us to stay in because they want to tie us in to this increasingly globalized government system.
Yes, and further away, we have no control over what's going on in your lives. And I think that's the key phrase there, that rousing speech that was given by Boris Johnson, where he says, tomorrow can be our Independence Day. I mean, do Britons really want to govern themselves, or do they want to be governed by some European superstate that is dominated by the Germans? I really don't understand that. I mean, there was a back and forth talking about Neville Chamberlain, and they made a good point on that the other day when they questioned Cameron on that. I want to play that clip and get your reactions to it. But I see that as another issue of appeasement and surrender.
That is a very fair comparison. And of course, the entire establishment throughout Europe was for appeasement in the era immediately before the Second World War. And I'll bet you'll never guess which the first state to speak out against Hitler openly and publicly was.
What was that?
It was actually the Holy See. It was the Pope Pius XII, as he was to become. He was then secretary to Pope Pius XI, who issued in German an encyclical letter, the first time it hadn't been in Latin since the early Middle Ages, and it was called Mit brennender Sorge, with profound concern. The Holy See spoke out against the Hitler regime, while everybody else, the Times of London, was for appeasement. I mean, indeed, the Daily Express in 1933 had disgraced itself by running a front-page story shortly after Hitler came to power, saying Germany is Britain's friend. And the author of its lead story was not one of its journalists, it was Joseph Goebbels. That was how much the establishment wanted the German Reich to survive and prosper. And now they want the new bureaucratic, the tyranny by Clark, which again is it's not just undemocratic, it's anti-democratic. And again, the establishment, which now hates democracy, viscerally hates democracy, wants to use the EU as a model for spreading effectively dictatorship worldwide. And you're quite right, David, when you say that democracy and independence are the issue. Are we going to be, once again, a sovereign nation? Are we going to get our independence back? And when you think that Britain was a great, proud and independent nation, the last time anyone invaded us was in 1066 AD. And now here we have the European Union invading us by stealth. Yes. And of course, about half the population will tend to side with the establishment, the gobblers, the people who are on the take. They love the EU because it's a paradise of vested interests. There are 20,000 lobbyists who infest Brussels and Strasbourg, and their job is to argue for various vested interests to get free handouts from the European Union, of course, at British and other taxpayers' expense. And how much say do we get in any of this? It gets back to your point, David, about democracy and independence. At the moment, according to the House of Commons Library, which has just done a survey, 3 laws in 5 that are made for us by our Parliament in the United Kingdom are in fact only made because Brussels says we must make those laws. Wow. These laws are being enacted because the European Union's commissars 28 unelected people who meet behind closed doors have issued what is revealingly called a directive, which we are then obliged, under pain of unlimited and continuing fines, to enact into law in the United Kingdom. Now, the German government did a survey 5 years ago, and its conclusion, which was put in front of its constitutional court at the time, which had insisted that this sum be done, they said that, in fact, 5/6 of all laws, 5 laws in 6, not even 2 in 3, but 5 in 6, were, in fact, enacted solely because directives by the unelected, unremovable, unaccountable, unquestionable commissars had ordered these laws to be made. That is how far from democracy we are. Now, you may say, oh, but I've heard of a thing called the European Parliament. Well, don't imagine that that is anything like a parliament. It is a fig leaf to cover the naked dictatorship behind. And this parliament cannot even bring forward a bill. Can you imagine if the United States had set up a constitution whereby the Congress was not allowed in either house ever to bring forward any new legislation?
We're getting close to that.
Isn't allowed. Yes, the European Parliament, of course, you are under Obama getting used to that, but that's not how it was supposed to work.
That's right. That's right.
And yet the Constitution of Europe is that the supreme law of Europe is proposed behind closed doors by the 28 commissars, is drafted behind closed doors by a committee called the Council of Ministers, which doesn't actually have any ministers on it. It's entirely bureaucrats. There's also a rather shadowy group called the Council of Permanent Representatives, another lot of bureaucrats that have their say. Then and only then it goes to the European Parliament. And of course, if right at the outset the commissars have decided to veto whatever law it was, then the European Parliament doesn't get its say at all. So this shows how undemocratic it is. And if the European Parliament should agree to the law proposed by the commissars, well, then it gets inflicted on us. But if they disagree, it gets inflicted on us anyway, because the commissars have and frequently exercise the right under the Treaty of Maastricht, in 5 different places it says this, to override, the unelected commissars can override the decisions of the elected Parliament of Europe. So this is an entirely anti-democratic constitution. In fact, it's very like the Soviet constitution on which it was modeled. And all that's happened is the Soviet constitution has moved westward, and we are now effectively the European Supreme Soviet.
And I would add, Lord Monckton, that what we are now looking at with the Trans-Pacific and the Transatlantic Partnership, Senator Sessions, who's one of the only senator that I know that actually looked at the agreement, has essentially said we're going to have the same thing with these trade agreements, where we're going to have an unelected, unaccountable bureaucracy that is going to be able to alter these things at will. There will be a living document, and we will have absolutely no control over them. So what you just described there in the European Union, where they can override all these deals, and of course, it's always about the money. They sell this as an economic opportunity, as an economic union, but then they use it to take our sovereignty. As Boris Johnson has said, and he's been one of the key voices on this, he says, we remain prisoners of a trade regime that will not allow this country, the 5th biggest economy on earth, to negotiate with America, China, India, or any other nation. He says that privilege is reserved exclusively for the hierarchies of the European Commission, of whose vast staff only 3.6% are British. Now, if they get this Trans-Pacific, Transatlantic Partnership, that will go from 3.6% to 0% for you. It'll go to 0% for America. We will have no say over the trade issues for our countries.
That's right. Now, we now have to do something about this. Of course, in Britain, if anybody is listening to this from Britain, for heaven's sake, if you still believe in democracy, and a surprising number don't, but if you do, then for heaven's sake, you have to vote leave. It is as simple as that. Don't be fooled by all the economic arguments that the Treasury has simply made up numbers to try and say we would go bankrupt if we were out of the EU. We'll go bankrupt for sure if we're in it. Let me give you one figure that tells you just how badly Britain has done in the EU.
Hang on with that figure, Lord Monckton. We got to go to a commercial break, and we'll be right back. And we also have a clip. We'll talk about the other issue that came up in this, and of course, that is immigration. That has economic consequences, but it has vast consequences for the entire society. We'll talk about that when we come back with Lord Monckton. Brexit is tomorrow. Will it be Britain's Independence Day or the day they quietly cease to exist? We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, your host. We're going to go back to Lord Monckton. He had we had to go to a commercial break. He had one key factor that he wanted to tell us about with the Brexit. Of course, that's coming up tomorrow. The vote as to whether or not